Welcome to the webinar today on relationships, working in a positive way with others. As you all know, humans are hardwired to connect. They are social creatures, and they crave friendship and social interaction, positive interactions with others. The purpose of this webinar today is first to prove the impact of having positive relationships with others, and we want to show you the evidence we have to say there is a significant impact of your ability to build relationships with others. The second part of the webinar is really to help you understand how you might be able to improve your relationships with others. Now, the way we're going to show you that data is not from a kitchen table analysis or from our great wisdom or thoughts. We're going to show you from our data. We've looked at thousands and thousands of pieces of data to try and understand what are the key elements to a positive relationship and having a positive relationship. And we're going to challenge you to find a couple of those things that you could work on. And I think everybody can work on something here to improve your relationships, both at work and outside of work. Now, when we think about relationships, we're really thinking about three items that we use to measure relationships. And these tend to be nerve-ending items. These really create a lot of interesting dynamics. This first one, balancing results with a concern for the other needs. Just this morning, I was looking at some data, and I looked at this item. It was the number one differentiating item for high potential leaders. And this is an organization that was really pushing people hard and really forcing a lot of work on people. The best leaders were really good at creating that balance of showing their concern for individuals. The second item, being trusted by all members of the work group. Now, when I'm working with individual managers and I see that as one of the most negative items, that is a red flag. Because when you lose the trust of others, there's just significant outflow, negative outflow from that. Jack, have you seen that in your coaching?
Very, very much. When that trust score goes down, virtually nothing else kind of redeems it. I mean, they just don't. No matter how good they are at strategy, no matter how good they are at driving for results or business acumen or anything else, if they're not trusted by their colleagues, by their subordinates, they're not going to succeed.
And on the other hand, when that's really high, it's just a signal for me that this person is really esteemed highly by their colleagues. And the third one is staying in touch with the issues and concerns of individuals in the group. How often does something happen in the group and you're the last one to hear about it? You're like going, what? Well, it happens a lot for me because I'm out of town a lot. But again, really, when you're good at relationship building, those three items are incredibly predictive. Now, I want to show you some data here. We took that one competency, relationship building, and we looked at leaders' effectiveness on that from the worst leaders, those at the 1st to the 10th percentile, to the best leaders, 91st to 100th. And then we looked at engagement. How much people loved their job, they loved working there, they weren't thinking about quitting, they felt like the strategy was good. What's interesting is the relationship between relationships and engagement. The better people were at building positive relationships, the higher the engagement of employees. And again, worst leaders about the 25th percentile, best leaders almost the 80th percentile in terms of engagement. Another study we did looked at percentage of people that think about quitting. And again, this is 66,000 leaders, and what we're seeing here, again, if you're really poor on relationships, almost 48% of the people think about quitting. Now, we actually know there's a correlation that if 48% think about quitting, about half that number actually quit. And then, again, the best leaders, only about 13% think about quitting. So there's a relationship between how good you are at relationships and the percentage of people that think about quitting. The last one is, I think, the bottom line. This is discretionary effort. Every employee every day decides, if I'm going to give you all my energy, all my effort? Am I going to give you 120%, or am I going to give you the minimal amount to keep my job? Well, what you see here is those who are poor on relationships get about 14, 15% of their employees who are willing to give 120%. But when you're great at relationships, over 60% of your employees willing to give you that extra effort. And that makes a difference in terms of profitability, ability to get projects done, and everything else in the workforce.
So, Joe, this is a topic that sometimes people look at and say, well, this is, relationships is about helping you to produce better results, and it's a means to an end. And we would like to just propose that on this particular topic, that building strong relationships for many people in business has the qualities of being almost an end in and of itself. Relationships, fill a very important human need, one for belonging and having a sense of purpose. And so having relationships at work gives it meaning and purpose. And for lots of us, if our work has no meaning and purpose, then life has no meaning and purpose. I think this has particularly gained, more steam in the last few years as the nature of organizations has begun to shift. The nature of relationships become even more important. In a more traditional hierarchy, based on a very steep pyramid, roles were pretty well defined, and how people treated each other were fairly kind of spelled out. And it was often signaled by the way they kind of dressed and the language they used and the, how they just presented themselves in life in general. As the organization changes and the layers in the organization begins to flatten out, there are major changes in this importance that relationships take on. For example, we did a study that looked at leaders moving up the management hierarchy. What's the difference between people when they were individual contributors, then when they moved to becoming supervisors, and then as they moved forward in their career to more senior management positions, and finally top management positions? And as you see here, it's fascinating that when people were individual contributors, they were kind of above average on the scale that describes collaborative behavior versus acting in an autocratic kind of way. But suddenly, when they're made a supervisor, either it's because they thought that was what was expected of them, or maybe organizations tend to choose people with a slightly more autocratic bent to them. But it's interesting how that drops down now into the scale of being autocratic, more autocratic than they were collaborative. And then it's not until, kind of they get into middle management positions that they begin to kind of get back where they were when they were individual contributors. Now, I don't know about you, but my experience has been in organizations that senior people, if they can have conflict and they can be very nice to each other and they can pretend that it's all under the table. But the people who report to them are often out there on the battlefield, carrying their spears, and they're killing each other out of loyalty to the person that they report to. I think senior people have learned that the organization works better when relationships are positive. And so you see that as people progress in their career, that their ability to function in a collaborative, harmonious way goes up. So as we mentioned, flatter organizations require a different kind of behavior. They require more influence, more persuasion. You can't just give direction and orders to people. And the spread of technology has certainly made information flow more freely in organizations. And so my hunch is, I'd be curious about yours, Joe, but we're hurtling down this path of moving toward flatter, networked organizations. That says to me the quality of relationships is going to become increasingly important as the years go forward.
They do, and even the perception of senior leaders and how accessible they are and how willing they are to kind of engage with people versus, nobody knows who they are, and that whole sense of how their concern or consideration for others, that spreads a long way in the organization and has a terrific impact. Actually, the other thing I was thinking about today, sometimes we think about relationships as a one-way bridge. It's like bosses say, well, what will positive relationships do to help my people work harder or be better or do that, something like that. But as you think about it, when bosses have positive relationships, their life's better. I mean,
much better.
It not only helps the people that you work with, but it helps you because your life feels better and more fulfilled. And I think this basic need we have to have positive relationships is critical. So does it matter? Does it make a difference? Let's start with this study we did where we looked at the most high potential leaders in a very large organization. And these were the best leaders. This is an independent rating of the effectiveness of these leaders. And when we looked at relationship building, we found that there was a significant difference between those who were lower rated in terms of their leadership effective or their potential. They were at the 45th percentile. But the best leaders, these high potential leaders, were viewed as having better relationships. And so we're thinking that one of the elements of being a very valued leader is building positive relationships. We also looked at the difference between males and females, and not surprising, for most people, females tended to be viewed as having better relationships than males. Now, it's not a huge difference, it's only 4 percentile points, but it is statistically significant. Now, I think that a lot of people would believe this because they assume that females are more nurturing, but I would caution to say that the competency with the biggest difference here was taking initiative. The difference was much more significant than this one, but they were also better on building relationships. If you look at this relationship between age and relationship, your ability to develop relationships, and gender, what you see is that males early on in their career, when they're younger, tend to be slightly better, be viewed as better at building relationships. But there's this funny thing that happens at age 40, and can you see the grumpy old men?
The grumpy old men coming in. Yeah, that's right. The old curmudgeons.
That would be us. No, we're trying to break the trend there. But you see that gap between males and females as they age. And then if you look at the management levels, it also creates this interesting thing that supervisors are viewed as having better relationships than top management. Now, I find that a lot of senior leaders have this dilemma, Jack. They often ask me the question, can you be too close to people? Do you need a distance? Do you need – I actually sat down with a leader once, and he had really low scores on trust and relationships. And I said, why are you so low? And he says, well, I may need to fire these people, so I need to keep this distance between myself and them. What advice do you give people in senior roles when they feel like they have to create that distance?
Well, I think the observation that you've made is the same one I've made, is that I think it was an old military idea that there had to be distance, social distance between the leaders and the enlisted people. And the argument was, well, I may have to send them, up the hill into enemy gunfire, and I can't be too close to them, and I'm going to lose my command position if I become too close of a friend. And we've done some research, as you well know, inside organizations that shows, to the contrary, the most effective leadership relationships seem to be those that are close, warm, personal, no indication of deliberate distance being created.
And again, we go back to those original studies where we looked at engagement, looked at percentage of people quitting, and discretionary effort. And again, the better the relationships, the higher those numbers were. Well, In terms of how a relationship is ranked in terms of importance, it's ranked number 7, 7th out of 16 competencies. We looked at which functions in the organization tend to be relationships tend to be viewed as being more important. Now, HR was number 1, and by a large margin, actually. 38% said that HR and training relationships were critical there. It's nice to see them out on top here. I was surprised. Information technology was number 2. Sales, that's not a surprise. Number 3, safety. You can see the facilities, research and development, engineering were lowest, but even the low ones are at 25%. Mm-hmm. And my conclusion after looking at this is, look, I don't care what function you're in. Relationships, having positive relationships with others is important everywhere.
So as you look at an organization's ability to be highly productive, to get things done efficiently, to make sales, and to get project teams to work well with each other and to fulfill orders, there seem to be 2 very important elements to make that happen. One is the organization's quality of relationships, and the other is their ability to execute effectively and efficiently. And I want to talk with you about the combination of these 2 qualities and how they combine to produce great results for the organization. If you look at people and organizations where their relationships are poor and their execution is poor, you know it's not going to be a very productive organization.
That's bad.
And the U.S. Congress, I write right now, this is the year 2016, characterized by poor relationships, poor execution. Their public, approval rating is about 3 or 4%, and you just, you see that playing out. So if you look at organizations that have one of these, people who are in the top 25% in terms of the quality of their relationships, but their execution is below the top 25%. They're somewhere below that. And we think about, clubs or associations or sports organizations where the relationships between the people are just great, but they're not particularly wonderful at execution. Their performance, the chances of that group being extraordinary, providing extraordinary leadership is only at the 8th percentile. If you flip that kind of backwards and you say, okay, what if the relationships are not all that great, but people are really good at execution? And they're very efficient. They're like athletes who are really top performing athletes, but don't play well as a team. Again, you see here that the probability of that team providing extraordinary leadership for the organization is now only still at 8%. I'm reminded years ago, I was living in California, and when the air conditioner would turn on in our home, the lights would dim. So we knew we were a little bit short on power. So I contacted the local utility, and they, after much kind of fighting, we kind of agreed they would come out and lay a new power line to our home. And we had to negotiate the time they'd be there and having the mechanical, the machinery there to dig the trench. And after going through all kinds of hassle with them, finally the lady on the other end of the line said, "Oh, by the way, do you want this power connected?" And I really had to restrain myself from making some really smart alecky comment. But I thought to myself, this place wouldn't work at all if there weren't some good relationships in the organization that would somehow bring these different departments together. So clearly the people that were laying the power line weren't the people connecting the power line, and she was going to do me a favor by reaching out to the group that was going to connect it. So it's when those 2 things occur simultaneously that you get any kind of efficiency. And what we've seen then from our research is if both of these qualities are a strength, that is, if people are in the top 25%, then the chances of them being an extraordinary leader would be at the 84th percentile.
It's a little bit like it's the grease that makes it possible. That those relationships really take that power and make it engaged. And again, we see that the power of relationships is in combination with execution, and again, that's how you have a great organization. So we're going to move into that part where we talk about, okay, so how would I improve relationships? Now, some people have really poor relationships. They are, let's say you had a significant weakness and you want to improve. And some things you could do that would help is, one, you could smile. Two, you could be nice as opposed to mean. Or three, you could tell others you like them and appreciate them and thank them and those kinds of things like that. One of the things that we spent a lot of time thinking about is that the way you move from bad to good is different from the way you move from good to great. So again, if this is a weakness, it's pretty obvious for most people when they're bad at relationships what they could do to improve. And these are just three ideas. But what's interesting from our perspective is you think about how you would build a strength. Let's say that relationships, you were pretty good at relationships, but you wanted to be great at relationships. People would say, well, how would you get better? And they come up with stuff like, well, smile more, or be really nice, or tell others you love them. Well, I don't think that's the way. What we find is that people know how to fix a weakness, but they don't know how to build a strength. Well, what we did is we looked at thousands and thousands of leaders. We gathered data on them, and we got assessments over these thousands of leaders on their ability to build relationships. And then what we looked for were these what we call companion behaviors. Companion behaviors are levers. They are the ways that people move from good to great. Now, these are particular companion behaviors that seem to have the strongest relationship and the strongest correlation between building relationships and that behavior. And what we know is that by using these levers, if you will, that's the way that we can build relationships.
So if you look at that diagram, you see the one up there at 1 o'clock, collaboration and teamwork. Then we kind of go around the circle clockwise. They are shown there in a descending order from a statistical point of view. We then, in kind of looking at them, said, well, that's the way the statistics kind of play out. Let's kind of think about them conceptually in three kind of clusters. And the first cluster has to do with what goes on inside the leader. It's his or her mindset and attitudes. And so we thought that a couple of those companion behaviors fit appropriately in that category. Secondly, then we looked at how people relate one-on-one with each other. And we've listed 5 of those companion behaviors that seem to fall in that category. And then finally, building relationships has to do with how people function in teams and networks, and a couple of them fit there. So as we talk about those companion behaviors, we're going to follow them kind of in this order.
So let's start with this issue of optimism. A few weeks ago, I was with a group of leaders in Philadelphia, and in the group, there were 3 cynics. Now, as I met these 3 people, they were very smart. They appeared to have good technical skills. They understood the business inside and out. Some of them had won major awards and were viewed positively by the business in general. But when I looked at their leadership effectiveness scores, I found that as a group, the 3 were at the 32nd percentile. And, I thought how unfair this is. But as a group, the glass was not half full. There was no glass. I mean, and even in the class, it wasn't hard to identify these people because early on they were skeptical about the program,
challenging, asking questions.
They were kind of a pain in the rear end, I tell you. But as I sat down with them all individually, what I found out is that they had knowledge. They were good at spotting problems. They anticipated problems. They kept promises. They followed through on objectives. They good at achieving goals. But when people evaluated them, they saw them as uninspiring, low energy. They created conflict. In fact, that was one of the biggest issues, is that they were always kind of in the middle of things and sort of challenging stuff, and it's like, gosh, enough. And then they had an inability to market things. They discouraged others from coming up with new ideas. It was always never good enough, and little interest in developing others, focused more on getting results than the others' needs. They weren't trusted, poor communication skills. I guess I saw that effect of this pessimism, the effect of being cynical. And I actually wrote a blog about the cost of cynicism. And Jack, you've seen this too, haven't you?
Seen it very much. In fact, I was really struck by an article that was in the Harvard Business Review some years ago. One of their editors had interviewed a man named John Gottman. John Gottman had received a great deal of press in years gone by. He's a marriage therapist and student of married relationships. And he had gotten some very interesting press about the fact that he had data that showed that if he could spend about a half hour with a couple and could videotape kind of their interaction, particularly if they were interacting about some relatively difficult emotional topic, that he could predict with about 90% accuracy whether that couple would be together 3 or 4 years later. And what was fascinating about this article that had been written about him was relationships were important in business, and that lots of the same principles that applied to relationships in marriage also applied to relationships in business. And the thing that she asked him on one occasion, so if you had some advice to give to people about how they could improve their marriage, he used this very fascinating metaphor. He said, I would advise people to get a salt shaker full of yeses. And that when a conversation comes up, when your spouse asks you to do something or asks you about, you want to go here, you want to do this, do you want to go with me here, answer yes. What struck me about that was I remembered a conversation that I'd had with a very senior information technology director from a high-tech company who said, when we receive a request from one of our internal customers for some IT service or program, and we have to say no, I think we failed. Failure is having to say no to what people believe to be a really reasonable request. Now, obviously, there probably are moments when you have to say no, but being able to say yes the great bulk of the time really does transform relationships.
That's great advice. I'm hoping my wife isn't listening to this webcast. What about those yeses? Another way you can really influence your relationships is by practicing self-development, and specifically by asking for and acting on feedback. It's such a simple thing. But what we did is we're showing you a study here where we looked at people who were above average on asking for feedback, right, and acting on feedback, and those who were below average, and then we looked at this at different age groups. And then what we're showing you is the relationship percentile. And it's really clear that if you just do this one thing, if you just ask for feedback, your ability to improve your relationships goes way up. And the point here is that sometimes you're being a jerk and you don't know it unless you ask.
Unless you get some feedback.
Well, and I think one of the hard things is that people ask the wrong way. If I were to, at the end of this, go to our listeners and say, was that a pretty good podcast? What would I hear? Well, sure, yes. I'm not asking for feedback. I'm trying to bait you to tell me I did a good job.
You're fishing for compliments. That's right.
I am. But a better way to ask is to say, what could I have done or what could we have done to make this even a better podcast? What could I have done to improve significantly over what I did? And then it sounds like I really want your feedback.
So now we move from what goes on within the individual to what goes on in the interaction between a manager and a subordinate. And we have here some data that doesn't come as any surprise to most of you, and that is that if you plot relationships on the vertical axis and you plot on the horizontal axis their ability to listen, you see this very dramatic relationship, that the people who are in the bottom 10 percentile of listening have a pretty low score when it comes to their overall relationships, whereas people in the top 10% in their ability to listen are way high. They're up at the 87th percentile.
Well, if you ever needed evidence.
And there it is. And, you know, what's fascinating is we teach a lot of listening skills as part of our coaching programs, and one of the things that you often will ask a group is, do you know how to be a good listener? And you can ask people to kind of make a list of what constitutes good listening, and they'll very quickly come up with a list that looks a lot like the one you see on the screen. Yeah, you need to close your laptop, you need to clear away any distractions, you need to ask good questions of the other person, you need to kind of paraphrase what they've had to say and nod or give an expression that lets them know that you understand what they're saying. And so this combination of being attentive, of responding, of asking good questions, of being clarifying to be sure that you've heard what they've said, that's what listening is all about. And most people know how to listen. They just don't do it. It takes a little more time.
It does, and I find that just that desire to really know or really understand another person, people that do that well, what a fantastic skill at building relationships. So already in this webinar, you've got 3 tips: optimism. Is the first one, and then the second one is asking for feedback, and then listening. That's really good. The third one is communicating powerfully. In a study of over 9,000 direct reports on behaviors that did the most to impact the extent to which team members felt well informed, what we found were these 7 keys. And again, if you read down through the keys, keep in mind the needs and circumstances of others, set clear, measurable standards, provide others with specific feedback, positively review team members' progress, define specific actions, act as a positive catalyst. They knew how to inspire and motivate. If you read down through the list, and I've put in red these emphasis words, but it's all about understanding needs, being clear, being specific, being positive, and being inspiring. And communication can do a lot. I find that right now we're all in a dilemma about when to send an email and when to make a phone call. And Jack, just this morning, I needed to communicate to one of our folks out in the field, and I thought I'll send him an email. But I thought about it, and I thought, you know what? This is going to result in 4 emails. And why not just a 2-3 minute conversation, which went a lot better? I think we err here. How many of you have got into that rhythm where you're in the 15th email exchange and you think, this is really ridiculous. We should have just picked up the phone and talked. I think we might email too often when we need to have a conversation.
We should probably all make our own little kind of rule of thumb that says if there's been 3 emails going back and forth, then it's time to kind of pick up the phone and call.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, we move on to the next topic, which is providing rewards and recognition. This is one more of those one-on-one interactions that occur that truly build relationships. And here you see plotted against, on the vertical axis are the quality of relationships. On the horizontal axis, there is the item that talks about looking for opportunities to recognize and reward the accomplishment of others. And I guess for me, Joe, the operative kind of idea there is that this is looking for opportunities to recognize and reward accomplishments, not waiting for something terribly dramatic to have happened or having it sort of pushed in, on you, but to really go out looking for opportunities. That's what seems to make the huge difference.
I think you're right, Jack. And when we look for those opportunities, we find some.
Now, there have been lots of people who have written about this topic. Many of you are familiar with the work of Ken Blanchard on catching people doing things right, and that he kind of published originally in the 1 Minute Manager. I've been particularly impressed by the writings of Carol Dweck, who has written this wonderful book called Mindset, where she talks about the importance of not only recognizing people, but what you recognize them for, and that the best parents and the best managers have the wisdom not to sort of recognize people for being smart or for being creative or for being a good artist or whatever, but to recognize and to appreciate their tenacity, their hard work, their perseverance in getting things to happen. So part of this issue of providing rewards and recognition is not only doing it frequently, looking for opportunities to do it, but it's really around also rewarding and thanking people for the right thing. In summary, I guess what the research that I've been reading about relationships would say is a strong relationship with somebody isn't built because of one momentous event that occurs between the two of you. It's based on frequent, small interactions over a sustained period of time.
You think about oftentimes when we drive how we're on autopilot, right? We don't even notice things on the way to work. And sometimes at work we're on autopilot. And we don't notice what people do, and take the time to notice and to call that out, and people really make a difference. The next one that's really critical here is honesty and integrity. And I love this picture here because it sort of explains the problem here. We've all been sold to. We've been to a car dealer, or we've bought a timeshare, and you think somebody is your new best friend. But if you call them back for service, or if there's something wrong with the car, you find that wasn't a relationship at all. But people can use relationships. There's a rule of thumb here. It is easy to make promises, all right? And you think about some promises that you've made. Maybe you've said these words, we never have layoffs here, right? Or you've got a job for as long as you want it. Or, don't worry, you're always going to be one of the top performers here. And I would caution every leader out there to be careful what they promise, because oftentimes these promises come back to haunt them, and people will, you think about the number of things that people forget, but if you make a promise, they'll never forget it, and that will always be something that's on their mind. The other thing that I think is something that I think is critical is that we should try to influence people with logic, with analytics, with rationale, with facts. But as soon as you try to influence people with relationships, you're manipulating them. And then that backfires. So don't use your relationship to influence people. Use rationale and logic.
The last of the one-on-one interactions that we believe really enables people to develop these strong relationships is their willingness to be focused on the development of that person. And so when a manager deliberately sends someone to attend a seminar or a workshop, when the manager takes time to sit down and have coaching conversations, those are the kinds of things that really, signal the manager's concern for their development. But there's one more area that I believe also is a very important tool in the manager's toolbox, and that is delegation. When you ask one of your colleagues to take on a project, you can say, well, we're in a hurry for this. I know you can do it, and you can do it on time and on budget, and so here. Or you can say, if it's true, I've been thinking about you. I've been thinking about your career, your future. I've got a project here for you that really will help you grow, will help you expand your capabilities, prepare you for your future both in the organization and longer term. And I think if we see those moments on the job, in the work itself, where development can play a role, that's when developing others really comes to life.
Well, and what's funny is oftentimes I'll see managers send people to training, but they do it begrudgingly. So they're whining about it. So here's this opportunity to build this great relationship, and you just ruined it because you send them begrudgingly. And,
or they'll call them in the middle of the program.
Right.
With a question. Right.
We see that all the time.
We see that. Mm-hmm.
The next, we're going to talk about this whole collaboration and working through teams. And again, there's this strong correlation between your ability to collaborate and have an effective team and relationships. Now, every one of our clients, every CEO I know is focused and concerned about collaboration in the organization. Jack, you've found that they're all just, we don't have enough, we need more. It's this thing that never gets resolved, I think, in a lot of organizations. It's such a strong need. And if you think about what happens, it's like, why don't we get the collaboration that we want? Why do we have poor collaboration in the organization? I think one of the reasons is that people, when they work independently, they figure they can own it, they can have more control over it, they don't have to spend time with other people, and because of that, they can get all the credit. But oftentimes what we find in most organizations is two heads are better than one, that you get better solutions. And when you collaborate, the other people in the organization have inputs that make the product better. So there's a very strong relationship between your ability to collaborate and your ability to build positive relationships in the organization.
The final companion behavior in this third category of how you relate to teams and networks has to do with practicing inclusion and diversity. There's been a lot published lately about organizations who have more diversity on their boards of directors seem to do better, both gender, racial, age. There's certainly a lot been published about what that does in terms of the internal operation of the firm. I guess for me, the importance of inclusion and diversity is back to building strong quality relationships in the organization where everyone feels like they're in a safe place, where they're valued for who they are, not just what they have produced in the last week or month, but that there's no group that is excluded. And again, the evidence seems to be that when people feel that, when they feel like they are included, and they feel that they're accepted for who they are, they end up being healthier and they end up being happier, and that impacts the customers. It impacts the overall culture of the organization. So this concept of inclusion and diversity really does have a strong link to the quality of relationships in the firm.
So, to summarize these different companion behaviors, as you think about what you could do to improve your relationships with others, you might try being more positive, focus on what's going right, being sincere and asking for feedback on what you might do to improve, focusing on listening more to this other person, asking them good questions and helping them understand your point of view or their point of view. Keep the other person informed. Let them know what, when, where, and how. Look for opportunities to praise and recognize and reward the other person. Be completely honest and act with high integrity. Identify a skill or an area of knowledge where this person might be able to develop. Resolve any conflicts and look for ways to increase your cooperation. And finally, appreciate the differences between yourself and the other person. Find ways to show that you value and appreciate these differences. If you can focus on a couple of those, if you can find two of those, they might be strengths already, but there are things that you could do better. What our data suggests is you can improve your relationships, and that will not only improve the engagement, commitment, and the ability of you to keep those people, but it also will improve your life a little bit. And that's the theme of this webinar. Well, we've enjoyed having you here today. I hope you've learned some new things. We're excited about relationships and would love for you to join us for our Leadership Summit that's coming up here in July. The summit is an opportunity for us to listen to what you're doing in your organization. We have a great group of speakers that will be joining us this year, and not only that, but Jack and I will be personally cooking you dinner, and I will cook you a steak, and it will be the best steak you've ever eaten, I promise. Oops, don't make promise. This is true. This one is a promise I can keep. Thank you so much.